Welcome to our introductory course on Eternalism, the divine philosophy of the eternal worlds. Unit 23, Connecting the Dots, Part 1. In this unit, we begin a short series of episodes that build on our foundational understanding of eternalism. We'll connect key concepts, apply 2- and 3-tier thinking, and map the intellectual terrain to deepen our grasp of essential topics. So far, we've only scratched the surface. Now we start putting the pieces together for a stronger foundation moving forward. By simply learning how to connect the dots between key concepts, such as grace and works, we sharpen our ability to see the bigger picture and navigate complex ideas with clarity and confidence. Let's start by creating 2 columns, doctrinal foundations on the left and gospel principles on the right. Under doctrinal foundations, we list 2 key aspects of the gospel introduced in Unit 1, its Christ-centered and covenant-based nature. These foundations give rise to 2 corresponding gospel principles, grace and works. Misunderstandings arise when grace and works are disconnected from their doctrinal foundations and treated as standalone principles, creating unnecessary conflict. This fuels the grace versus works debate, leading to confusion on both sides. Let's see how eternalism resolves this issue by clarifying the common misunderstandings surrounding 2 Nephi chapter 25, verse 23 in our gospel understanding. In 2 Nephi, Nephi declares, "For we labor diligently to write, to persuade our children and also our brethren, to believe in Christ and to be reconciled to God. For we know that it is by grace that we are saved after all we can do." This verse has sparked much debate on the relationship between grace and works. Using our 2-tier thinking tool, we can clarify the underlying conflict. Which has primacy, grace or works? If salvation is by grace, this suggests grace holds primacy over works. Yet the phrase, "after all we can do," implies that works are foundational and grace is conditional. Those who advocate grace alone reject any role for works in salvation. Conversely, those who take Nephi's words at face value may interpret grace as earned, raising the question, is it truly grace if it is a reward for righteous living? It is here where our philosophical tools and understanding of the philosophy of eternalism can rescue us from this ongoing conundrum and debate. Let's apply them now. In Unit 1, we emphasize that the Christ-centered and covenant-based nature of the gospel, while essential, lacked a deeper foundation, the reality-oriented nature of the gospel. This aspect, though always present, has remained implicit in gospel teachings. The role of eternalism is to make it explicit, grounding the gospel firmly in reality. In Unit 1, we illustrated eternalism's role in making the implicit explicit by comparing it to 2 images of a zebra, one faded and blurry, representing an implicit understanding, and the other sharp and clear, representing an explicit understanding. This helps show how the reality-oriented nature of the gospel has always been there, but eternalism brings it into focus. Here are 2 recent examples from church leaders that reflect this implicit reality-oriented understanding of the gospel. In 2008, Elder Kenneth Johnson stated, "It is important to understand that natural laws were not determined on the basis of popularity. They were established and rest on the rock of reality." In 2010, while speaking about God, Elder D. Todd Christofferson described his commandments in these reality-based terms. His commandments are the voice of reality. Describing laws as rooted in reality and God's commandments as the voice of reality highlights how this reality-oriented perspective has always been present in gospel teachings, though often implicit rather than explicit. Including the reality-oriented nature of the gospel as a core doctrinal foundation is crucial because it establishes truth as a key gospel principle. It also grounds grace and works on the rock of reality, rather than leaving them in the sandbox of theological speculation. With truth as a foundational gospel principle, the question naturally arises, what is truth? Latter-day Saints have long embraced the correspondence theory of truth, expressed in the Doctrine and Covenants as, and truth is knowledge of things as they are, and as they were, and as they are to come. With this understanding, we can distill truth down to its essence. And truth is knowledge of reality. As LDS Eternalists, we can now apply our understanding of the gospel and eternalism by connecting the dots between these foundational doctrines and gospel principles. Let's do that now. Doctrinal foundations give rise to gospel principles, and it should be clear to every Latter-day Saint that the restored gospel is both Christ-centered and covenant-based, as illustrated here. Since grace and works are rooted in this foundation, they too are naturally linked and inseparable, as separating them would mean disconnecting Christ from covenants and covenants from Christ, an idea that is not only doctrinally unsound, but entirely nonsensical from a Latter-day Saint perspective. As eternalists, the next key connection is tying the Christ-centered and covenant-based nature of the gospel to its reality-oriented nature. This is critical because it links grace and works to truth, as illustrated here, raising the question of which has primacy, reality or truth. The three-tier structure of eternalism places reality at Tier 1, above truth at Tier 2. As Elder Bruce R. McConkie stated, truth thus conforms to reality, is centered in God, and is as enduring as deity himself. Likewise, Christ holds primacy over covenants, as the entire covenant path is Christ-centered from start to finish. On the gospel principles side, we see a three-tier structure where truth holds Tier 1 status over grace and works, and grace holds Tier 1 status over works. This symmetry, where reality, Christ, truth, and grace all hold Tier 1 status, provides the philosophical and theological framework needed to untangle the confusion surrounding grace and works, particularly in regard to 2 Nephi chapter 25, verse 23. Let's turn to that now. With grace established as having Tier 1 foundational status over works, we can now use eternalism's three-tier structure to resolve the confusion by recognizing that works may hold Tier 2 status over grace, but only when grace is being referenced within a completely different, transitional, and derivative Tier 2 and Tier 3 context. In other words, grace always holds foundational Tier 1 status over works because it's rooted in the gospel's Christ-centered nature, which has primacy over its derivative, covenant-based nature. We can see then that we are saved by grace, Tiers 1 and 2. After all we can do, Tiers 2 and 3, is meant to be understood within a three-tier structure, as shown here. This kind of breakdown isn't unique to the gospel. Many programs follow a similar three-tier structure, such as the Scouting program, which we'll refer to later. Returning to our starting point, we can now see why the grace versus works debate causes so much confusion. The confusion begins when we ignore the doctrinal foundations that give rise to grace and works, treating them as separate, competing principles, rather than complementary truths rooted in the gospel's Christ-centered and covenant-based nature. After all, a conflict between grace and works would imply a conflict between Christ and his Christ-centered covenants, which is clearly nonsensical. In addition, without recognizing the reality-oriented nature of the gospel as a foundational doctrine and truth as a governing gospel principle, it becomes nearly impossible to resolve the grace versus works debate with any real clarity or confidence. By making the gospel's reality-oriented nature explicit, we avoid the confusion that arises when grace and works are unmoored from reality and truth, and instead get tangled in theological speculation and dogmatic claims. Ultimately, by connecting the dots and applying eternalism's two- and three-tier thinking to the gospel's doctrinal foundations and principles, we move beyond the confusion and resolve the grace versus works tension that never should have existed in the first place. Thus, Unit 23 has shown the power of eternalism when paired with gospel understanding. By connecting the dots between doctrinal foundations and gospel principles, using grace and works as a case study, we've seen how eternalism brings greater clarity, deeper insight, and lasting resolution to long-standing gospel questions. Before we wrap up this episode, I have a bonus question and assignment for you to think about. We'll go over it in the Unit 23 Overview Quiz podcast. Here's the bonus question. How does the three-tier structure of the scouting program reflect the same access and advancement pattern found in the gospel program of grace and works? And how does this parallel help clarify the grace versus works relationship? And here's the assignment. Using the three-tier thinking template we applied earlier to the gospel program, try filling in that same structure for the scouting program. As you do, pay attention to how clearly the parallels emerge, showing that the gospel structure of grace and works follows a familiar and meaningful pattern. We'll review it together in the quiz episode. This ends this Unit 23 presentation. Thank you for watching. Join us for Unit 24 as we continue connecting the dots, tracing the origins of individual rights from existence itself to the institutions that uphold them. Also, don't forget to complete the Unit 23 Overview Quiz and the bonus question assignment comparing the gospel program of grace and works to the structured process of access and advancement in the scouting program.